Well, good morning, everyone. As I'm scrolling through, I realize I think we have representatives from 6 continents on this call, which is absolutely amazing. Um, Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about purchasing as a key strategy for accessing more food in our communities as we serve those in need. I'm Karen Hanner, and I am the Director of Product Sourcing and Strategic Partnerships at GFN, and I'm thrilled that you're able to join. Today I am joined by 3 wonderful representatives from the network that have some great experience. First, we have Brianna Casey, who's the CEO from Food Bank Australia. She's joining us. It's midnight her time frame, so thank you for either staying up and drinking and joining us or taking a quick nap. Then we have Vandana Singh, who's the CEO from the India Food Bank Network, and she's at a reasonable hour, those of you in Asia Pacific. So thank you for joining, Vandana. And then Ashley Davis is the commercial manager from FairShare, our member in the UK. Ashley, thanks for joining us. And you are actually at a really wonderful time zone this time. So we appreciate all of you joining and are particularly grateful for your willingness to share your experiences and your expertise with your colleagues in the network. Recognizing that purchasing is an important strategy, it's new to some, and it's an established resource for many members. So we appreciate this breadth of conversation. Before we get started, I've got a couple of housekeeping items that I need to make sure that we have. First of all, Spanish language is available. You can click on the bottom where it says interpretation and you can select either English or Spanish. And then Monica Dicus is on from our GFF team to be able to translate into Spanish. Monica?
Buenos días. Si desea escuchar esta sesión en español, por favor haga clic en el botón Interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla y escoge Español.
Gracias. There. Okay, now to ask questions, you can either raise your hand by using the little icon, and Anthony is on from our team who will be watching for hands that are raised, or you can also type in the chat. That would be a great way for us to be able to see your questions and incorporate them in the conversation. Hopefully you've all had a chance to review the materials that were posted prior to the session so that you have some of the background in terms of where each of these great networks are in terms of their food sourcing. But if not, that's certainly fine. We're going to provide some background, but feel free. We're really going to depend on attendees to be able to ask questions so that we can answer and provide information that are appropriate for what challenges you're facing in your communities. We will have the case studies are posted on the website now, and this will be available as a recording, I believe. So after this session, if you have other team members or you want to go back and listen to a particular part, feel free to be able to access through the GFN FBLI website. It'll be posted on there probably in a day or so. Okay, well, thank you all again for joining. To start off the conversation, let's start with Vandana. I'd like to set the scene. For the attendees, give us a little bit of background in terms of IFBN's general food sourcing and specifically how purchasing had been a key what purchasing had meant from a food sourcing perspective prior to COVID, and then explain the changes during COVID and how you and your team had to change and how purchasing was a key strategy for your team.
Thank you, Karen. India Food Banking Network is a network of about 32 food banks spread out all over the country. As you are aware, India is a very vast country with 1.3 billion people. And not only is it geographically very big, but also there's a lot of cultural diversity between the regions. Prior to COVID, the main source of food for IFBN has been the surplus packaged food industry, packaged food inventory from the food businesses. And we also had some school nutrition programs where we served fresh meals, nutritious meals to children in schools for underprivileged children. This was pre-COVID. However, when the pandemic broke out, what happened was India's strategy was to go in for an immediate, complete, extended nationwide lockdown. This helped us to avert the pressure on the healthcare system. But the lockdowns resulted in a drop in economic activity and loss of livelihoods, especially for migrant workers and workers in the unorganized sector, who started to face a lot of distress and food crisis. Fortunately, the government of India responded also immediately with the distribution of grains through a public distribution system, which is a very big, program of the government of India. But India Food Banking Network also immediately hit the ground running and was able to also distribute essential products to the distressed people or the vulnerable families. Now, what happened is that these families needed more of essential staples, which is like rice, wheat flour, pulses, cooking oil, spices. And these products were not which was donated to us by the food businesses in the surplus food which we were collecting during the pre-COVID time. And therefore, we needed to, purchase these products from the market. And we therefore immediately pivoted to the program of purchase of products and started sourcing of funds from the donors. Fortunately, we had a lot of strong partnerships built over the years, which helped us to coordinate our response, and we could make these purchases of these products from the open market. We are really grateful to our partners, including the Global Food Banking Network, all of whom, sort of exceeded our expectations, rose to the occasion and supported us in our program for purchase of products for the Emergency Food Assistance Program.
Great. Thank you, Vandana. I think you hit on one of the major challenges during COVID, which was the misalignment between donations that were available and the need of the communities in which you were serving, which is kind of a theme. Brianna, from Food Bank Australia's perspective, you similarly have a large country that you're trying to serve. Can you explain some of the same challenges that you had pre-COVID and during COVID that impacted your purchasing program? Thanks.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for joining. Really glad that you're here. And for those of you playing at home, we've got a briefing note that you will have seen in the file. And I know Anthony's put something in the chat letting you know where they are. So that gives you a bit of indication of what purchasing looks like at Food Bank Australia, both in normal times and what's happened in the last 12 months. For us at Food Bank, it's really important that I set the scene in terms of the environment that we entered COVID. And we went from a situation where in normal times, about 85% of what we do is through food rescue, and the remaining 15% is through procurement. And traditionally that procurement is both for our school breakfast programs, where we buy all of the breakfast cereals and bread and spreads and so on that we use in those programs. But we also buy a lot of product for our hamper programs, whether that be Christmas hampers or natural disaster hampers, as well as products that we just can't get in reliable supplies through food rescue. So there are staple products like pasta, breakfast cereal, etc. For us, we went into the beginning of 2020 with catastrophic bushfires, and a lot of you will have seen that in the media. We had bushfires affecting a huge part of the continent, and we had to mobilise food from warehouses right across the country into Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales. So when COVID hit us in March, we had already depleted our stores of food and groceries, which meant that we were already on the back foot. And the challenge that we had in Australia was we saw panic buying and supply chain disruption that meant that even if we were able to get early funds flowing throughout our network, there was nothing for us to buy. So we were dealing not only with the challenge of securing funds to be able to procure food that was not available through rescue, but also the fact that supply chain disruption meant that the products weren't available either. So we went from a scenario where traditionally we would get huge volumes of food and grocery items through food rescue, to that drying up literally overnight. A lot of our manufacturers in Australia were doing triple and quadruple shifts to try and keep up with what was going on in the supermarkets, and it meant that we weren't seeing those opportunities come through rescue. So we were very fortunate in that we were able to, one, procure funds both through corporate Australia and through the federal government. And traditionally we get less than $1 million a year through government. And in the case of COVID, combined with some bushfire funding, we were in a scenario where we had $15 million to play with Australian dollars, which was quite extraordinary for us. And what we had to do at that point, and I know we'll talk about it later in the session, is really leverage those relationships that we have with our food and grocery manufacturers and our retailers to be able to secure the right food at the right times in an environment of really chaotic supply chain disruption.
Excellent. Thank you, Brianna. It is interesting to think that COVID didn't happen in isolation, right? It clearly, right? There's many other factors, which actually, Ashley, you can speak to as well, because I hear there's this little thing called Brexit that's been sort of threatening in the news for a while, that perhaps has been disrupting your supply chains as well. So can you also talk about sort of pre-COVID purchasing and then what changed as a
Sure.
result of the pandemic? Thank you.
So I guess it's probably true to say that for FareShare in the UK, purchasing is perhaps more an unusual concept than what you've kind of just heard. So in a kind of a normal year, FareShare's existed for around 26 years, and generally probably about 96% of our volume, which has grown obviously considerably over that time, is surplus food for all the kind of reasons you would understand. Less than 2% was purchased, and that purchase would have, a lot of that, albeit small, would have been ad hoc, done at we operate 24 regional centres, as we term it, dotted around the UK. So obviously Brexit has now essentially happened in that we've sort of passed the 31st of December deadline, but sort of preceding that there were a few other sort of deadlines that sort of we crept up, and there was uncertainty about the deal and the no deal. So the first really significant purchasing effort that FareShare was involved with was funded by Scottish Government. So in the UK, Scotland and Wales have devolved parliaments that have a certain degree of autonomy when it comes to sort of budgetary matters. And Scottish Government gave FareShare in Scotland, where we operate 4 warehouses, an amount of money so that they could ensure the integrity of the food supply to those 4 warehouses was maintained across a Brexit deadline, with all the threats about sort of food being held up and delayed at ports and all of that sort of thing. And so we did that purchase through a food partner that was a wholesaler in part, and 1 or 2 other places, local sourcing in Scotland. But that was our first kind of dipping our toe kind of in the water, which is sort of well over sort of 12 months ago now. And at that time, we imagined that to be a kind of a one-off, albeit that not long after the Scottish example, we replicated that in Wales, where we have 1 regional centre on a smaller scale. And again, we reached out to existing food partners to see if we could buy certain elements. All of the food, I think, was what we would term ambient, so it's store cupboard essentials, not short life. That happened, and sort of, we moved on. There are still sort of repercussions of Brexit, obviously, but that was what it was. Then COVID happened. So to give you an indication of the sort of the change in the mix. So in the last 12 months or 11 months, we have over doubled the amount of food that we have redistributed. So in our year preceding sort of March 2020, we redistributed about 22,000 tons, and we will exit this year doing about 46,000 tons. So we're up something like 115%. The proportion of that food that was surplus will have dropped from about 95% down to about 60%. So more food, but a smaller proportion that is surplus. And that has in large part been down to what we would term donated food. So that's retailers coming forward and saying, here, have some stock which isn't identified as surplus for the reasons that we all understand, plus 2 big slugs of central government funding in England. So Westminster government, DEFRA, one sort of January, July time, one we're in the midst of now, which will finish sort of mid-March. So a very unusual sort of situation for FareShare and for FareShare's model, alongside a very unusual situation for what we kind of recognize as normal food redistribution. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great to have these different perspectives, because prior to COVID, you each had a different proportion of your food coming from the donation versus purchase. And obviously things changed for all of you, which I think is true for probably everyone that's on the call, is that circumstances for available food, COVID disrupted, and there was a need to find new sources. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. If you guys this is my New Jersey coming out. If anyone, the attendees have questions, please put them in the chat, or feel free to help us guide this conversation. But I want to ask each of you how you identified partners, recognizing that we all have a responsibility to get the best value out of our donors' funds, right? So being able to identify the sources for the product first, and then I want to talk about negotiating styles second. So maybe Vandana, can you share how you talked a little bit about how you have partners, right? Can you just build on that a little bit for the audience?
Okay. So as I mentioned before, that we were doing some purchasing that was mainly for the school nutrition program, which was in 4 cities. But now, as I said, that we started distributing emergency food assistance ration kits, so as to say, the essential staple products in about 32 cities. And so we had to immediately develop new vendors at all these new locations. And traveling was totally out of question because of the lockdown. So we had to establish relationship with new vendors, negotiate prices, agree on payment terms, control quality, and all this had to be done remotely. This was a very daunting task given the vast geography and diversity. So we reached out to one of our donors who is in the hospitality sector, and
You
they had vendors.
You can say who they are.
Okay, that was Sodexo, and they had vendors all over the country with whom they had been working for a very long time. So they connected us to these vendors. These vendors were very dependable, gave us great prices. Most of them even gave up their own profits also and gave it to us at cost price, and in fact added on to that by sort of bagging the products for us, delivering it to our locations. And all this was really very valuable, especially because supply chains had been disrupted. There were shortages, as Brianna also pointed out. There were price variations, in the market, and through these vendors, we were able to overcome those challenges. And also we had very few, volunteers also were not available at all the locations because of the lockdowns, and permissions were not there, for people to gather together and, volunteers to gather together and bag the products also. So these vendors did that also for us, which was indeed very valuable during that time.
That's great. What's interesting in that is both that you leveraged a current relationship to get to new relationships. And what's important is that you didn't just negotiate the pricing, but you negotiated the packaging and other things that would have cost your organization, if not monetarily, at least human capital. So that was a great, thought around getting them to do the packaging and distribution. Ashley, I'm going to come to you next because Brianna's is a lot more complicated. Why don't you share a little bit more about how you identified? You said you worked with a wholesaler, a distributor. How did you figure out who to work with, and particularly for the breadth of products that I think you were trying to fill?
Yeah. So I suppose, fortunately for us, the UK is a small place in comparison to Australia, and we are already in contact with most large manufacturers and retailers. So So the majority of FareShare's food comes from retail more than food service. And so we thought the easiest way was to reach out to existing food partners, as we term them, from whom we're already receiving food, and sort of almost go and say, well, look, we've got this sort of situation. What help can you give us? And in some cases, you know, we couldn't have picked a worse moment to try to buy food, because the food that we wanted was the food that was in most demand. We were funded by central government, who obviously have a responsibility to UK taxpayers to get good value for money. So we were essentially approaching commercial entities and saying, that sought after food that is making your profits, could we have some of it at near cost price, and use that to feed people, rather than you sell it in your stores to make a profit? And in some cases, you know, it was stuff that they were already short on, or was stuck on a shipping container coming from international sort of manufacturers and sort of thing. So, but I suppose the response we got was fantastic. So just about everybody who could help did help. If they couldn't help, in some cases with food, then they gave us funds to support the transport effort. So the purchased food that we sourced, we redistributed with a parallel supply chain. So rather than to get it all going through our existing sort of network, we ran something alongside to kind of alleviate some of that sort of congestion when it came to logistics. And so, you know, a retailer loaned us use of a central distribution facility. We don't have a central distribution warehouse at the moment. We have sort of 24 satellites. So we did that. We only purchased in the first buy ambient long life food. So there wasn't quite the need for rapid turnaround by buying sort of fresh meat with 5 days life on it, that sort of thing. Albeit that a requirement of getting the funds from central government was an ability to turn around the food and get it to the people who needed it within a short space of time, because obviously they had a public need to say, well, we've given FareShare this money, they've bought the food, sourced it, and they've got it out to the people they need within a rapid turnaround, rather than this sort of sit on it. So there was a pressure there, but we also saw that the organizations we currently supply with food, so FareShare supplies something in the region of, we were supplying about 10,500 charities, we're now supplying about 12,000 charities. They switched from a catering provision, where they might have been cooking a hot meal for 20 isolated elderly people. So they moved their model to providing a home delivery service to those 20 people of ambient store cupboard essential items. So my role at FareShare is sourcing ambient food. So we were required to source tins and packets and dry pasta and rice and things like that in a volume and in a mix that we were unfamiliar with too. So I think that was the biggest challenge. Everything was an adjustment. Doing purchasing, the model, the logistics, the mix of food, the food types, all of that was an adjustment. The only consistency that we had, fortunately, was that we reached out to existing partners who were able to help.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, a challenge, right? Brianna, can you share Food Bank Australia's experience too? Because some of it's parallel, but some of it's a little different.
Yeah, and I have to acknowledge we had to make a lot of this up on the fly, and I want to be really open about that there was no right or wrong way to deal with COVID. There was no playbook, so whatever we all gave a shot at, I commend a lot of us, because it was tough times. For us, our challenge in the very short term, when the lockdown started happening in Australia, was that we saw a 75% increase in demand for food relief. And at the same time we saw that increase, we saw a 27% reduction in supply of food and groceries. So we had this horrible scenario where demand continued to skyrocket and our ability to source food diminished dramatically. When we were able to secure some of those funds, we actually had to buy more food in a 3-month period than we had in the 3 years prior to 2020. So that meant really scaling up at every level. It meant a lot more of a burden for our teams that are involved in policy and advocacy and government relations in terms of securing the funding, understanding what the reporting needs would be around that funding, and their expectations around the use of those funds. Did they want us to only support Australian manufacturers? Did they want us to only source particular products that had particular nutritional outcomes? Did they want us to focus on regional communities or Indigenous communities rather than just cities? So we had to understand all of that. We were asking our supply chain team to operate at about 120% of their traditional capacity, which had already been stretched in January through the bushfires. So fatigue and tiredness within our teams was a real challenge for us during that period as well. We didn't have backup to be able to slot someone in and hit the ground running. We just kept going, and that's something that we're still keeping an eye on now. And for us, we had 2 really terrific things happen in terms of sourcing the food that we needed. One was our retailers, and in Australia, we have a duopoly. So we have 2 major supermarket chains that really run the retail food and grocery sector in Australia, and a couple of smaller ones. We went to each of those 2. In fact, I'm wrong. They came to us. I had phone calls from the CEOs of both of those retailers one weekend, very early in March, and they said, we know that we've got no product coming out of our distribution centres for you. We're sorry. What can we do to help? Here's $300,000 a week from each of us for you to be able to go and get that from any of our suppliers. Good luck. Go forth and conquer. We then went to those manufacturers and let them know that we were coming to them with the support of the retailers, and that we fully recognised that they had contractual obligations to the supermarkets that we might be asking them to stretch a little bit. And it was through those very deep and mature relationships we have with our manufacturers and the retailers that we were able to source food that really should have gone through to the supermarkets for sale to consumers. They set product aside for us, sometimes on the record, sometimes off the record, but they did what they could because they knew ultimately it would all come back to us anyway in terms of demand. Because when someone is vulnerable and they go to the supermarket and they can't buy what they need, they're left with very few options but to go to a food relief organisation. So they knew we were part of that bigger picture. We did also look to international sourcing. We looked to overseas countries. Obviously, the lead time of being able to get product from Europe or from parts of Asia onto ships through our quarantine checks, which were extreme during COVID and still are, and into Australia took time. So for us, it was around recognising if we bought rice from overseas in May, we may not get it until November. So being able to explain to our donors why, even though their funds had been delivered and spent, that the product hadn't necessarily landed at that point. So I think a lot of learnings for us around securing the funds in the first place, but then also recognising the huge responsibility that comes with, 1, being able to spend those funds quickly, but 2, reassuring your donors about what's happened with those funds and getting them on the ground with the same environment that we've heard from Vandana and from Ashley around the fact that the volunteer network wasn't there for us to be able to get those food out. And in Australia, one of the biggest barriers to getting the food out was our charity or agency or beneficiary organisation network closed. We had periods of COVID where 3/4 of our charities were not open. So we had to trial direct to client for the first time as well. That dramatically changed our purchasing.
That's a really good point, which I think impacted a lot of the countries that are on the call as well. Thanks for the comments in the chat. I'm going to start with a relatively quick one from Manuel from BAMX, and then with his follow-up one as well. For each of you, how did you distribute all the purchased product to your food bank members or warehouses nationwide or regionally? So maybe Brianna, since you're on, you can just quickly answer that because you've got a very broad network, and then we'll go Ashley and Vandana.
We do. We're like India in that we have a very vast country geographically, but unlike India, we only have a population of 25 million. So not as challenging in terms of getting to people. In Australia, we have a federated structure. So we have food bank warehouses in every capital city around the country. And we have 2 of those warehouses that are our distributing warehouses. So a lot of the food products that we secured came into Food Bank Victoria or Food Bank New South Wales. And we then on-shipped that product back into our other warehouses across the country. We leveraged a lot of transport support because we had a lot of issues, and we still do, with intrastate transport in Australia. So a lot of our state and territory borders have been closed. So getting permits to get trucks on the road and volunteers on the road across state borders was really challenging for us. So we were focused, 1, on getting it into the warehouses, and then 2, if the charities were closed, we set up pop-up markets. We have a pop-up supermarket in the CBD in Melbourne in Victoria, and we're doing a lot of direct delivery to client for the first time ever. So we're doing home delivery services, or setting up central hubs to be able to distribute, to go around the charities.
Interesting. I imagine that's some of the same challenges that BAMX in Mexico is facing with their network. Ashley, do you want to answer as well?
Yeah, so the vast majority of the food went to organizations that were sort of in effect already on our books that we were supplying with surplus food. That said, we did so as it happens, FareShare's kind of year starts 1st of April. So in the first quarter of our year, we waived the membership fees to lots of organizations, either existing or new ones who'd come on board. And a condition of the government money with the purchase was that we increased our sort of spread and reach of the food. So the way that sort of FareShare works is the food companies deliver into our sort of 24 warehouses, ideally all of them, but whatever mixture of them, and then vans driven by our volunteers then sort of go around and drop off that food to charities. So charities were effectively getting a mix of food, some of which was still surplus. Our surplus sort of volumes are up something like 20% year on year. Some of it was purchased and some of it was donated. So we had an ask out to industry to say, can you donate us food? We were buying food, the surplus sort of thing was still happening. If you were kind of on the receiving end as either a charity or beneficiary consuming a meal, you wouldn't necessarily know whether the beans you were eating came from a donation, were bought by us or whatever, really. So I think we didn't face some of the geographic challenges that we've just heard about. So we use sort of existing means of getting that food out. Yes, we got it to more places, but the method of getting it there was the same. We also engaged with some smaller redistribution organizations. So that helped our reach as well, in that we could deliver sort of in pallets to some of those places, and they in turn then sort of did their sort of bit of redistribution too.
Is this a place for you to also reference that you coordinated with other major charities in UK?
Yeah, so we had so we did some work, for instance, with British Red Cross. They obviously have a lot of volunteers on the ground to do the work with some of their kind of responses, and so we were able to channel out some food deliveries through them. So I suppose it's important to realise that FareShare is essentially a kind of a middleman in our model. We don't tend to do the last mile bit. We aren't preparing the food and we aren't serving it. But we did work with, as I say, people like Red Cross and some smaller charities to get food that in those last sort of mile, whether it's to individuals or to charities. So Trussell Trust, which is the largest network of food banks, as we term it in the UK, also they sort of had food going into their network from us, and then people were able to access that food by sort of presenting at a food bank.
Yeah, thank you. Just new partnerships during these new times. And Vandana, across your 32 organizations, how did you distribute?
Okay, so three things. Number one, as far as purchasing was concerned, we went in for decentralized purchasing, local purchasing, so that, you know, there were no challenges of transportation from one place to another. It would have been perhaps cheaper to buy at one place and, you know, send it to a couple of other places. But in view of the circumstances prevailing with lockdowns, etc., we went in totally for local purchasing. Then as far as distribution was concerned, immediately after the lockdown started, when the pandemic broke out, it was actually the police and the administration whose support we sought, and we really got it in great measure. Without them, we would not have been able to do much in the first month, definitely. So everywhere, even the police send their police vans to pick up food for us and to transport it to the distribution point. They actually also distributed it and clicked pictures and sent it back to me also. I mean, like, I was really grateful for that at that time. And the administration also was very helpful. And then after that, we went in for distribution. So as Brianna pointed out, most of the charities whom we were supporting, like schools for underprivileged children, orphanages, old age homes, homeless shelters, they were also closed. And therefore, we had to do more of direct distribution. Most of our food banks had been also doing some amount of direct distribution also, and therefore they were aware of the communities and they could identify the people in need, and they really scaled up the distribution directly to the vulnerable in the communities.
Excellent. That's, again, new partners, right? New opportunities. Manuel, I'm going to come back to your staffing question, but for now, Elijah from Food for All in Ghana has a interesting question. Not from Ghana, I'm sorry. He's from, yes, from Ghana. I did say that right. What percentage of food do you buy from businesses who originally donated food to you? And then does that affect the amount of food that they donate to you? That's a really critical question that we all struggle with, right? If we buy it, will they not donate it? So Ashley, why don't you take this one first, and then Brianna, and we'll give you a chance to breathe, Vandana.
So I would estimate probably well over 80% of the food we bought was from by volume was from existing food partners from where we're already sort of taking surplus. And I guess the kind of the argument that if we are seen to have, as a charity, if we seem to have money and to be purchasing food, that would discourage people from our organization from giving us their surplus, was probably always the reason why historically FareShare had never really entertained buying food. I mean, I suppose COVID is a kind of a unique proposition for the world, but actually what we found is that organizations understood that the need to buy food, that certain elements of the supply chain were closed down, and so we had to step into the market to find food for all these people who needed it. And so we haven't spent a long or large amount of time explaining why we needed to purchase. And as I said, our surplus volumes are up sort of 20% year on year. Now, some of that is because the food service sort of sector in the UK crashed, and so we had lots of restaurant suppliers and restaurant chains looking to divert food towards us that weren't previously doing so. But yes, it hasn't hampered our ability to still take surplus food, fortunately.
And then Brianna.
100% of our procurement that we conducted through COVID was through existing partners. Okay. The only change within our network was, for the first time ever, we were also buying private label product direct from the retailers. We hadn't been doing that previously. But other than that, all of our procurement was through existing partners. And we've included in the briefing materials that we prepared for this session a big section on myth busting. And one of our big myths that we wanted to bust was the fact that if you do move to a procurement model, that it would affect your donations. We find the opposite. We find that when our partners see us both as a potential customer as well as a beneficiary, it strengthens and deepens the relationship. It means that their employees right across the business understand who we are and what we do. And we have never once ever with any of our partners seen that when we are buying, that it's had a downward impact in terms of donations. In fact, it's been the opposite every time.
And it helps to have clarity around what you're purchasing, right? Around you buy first run fresh product, and then that really helps delineate, right?
Very
in terms
much
of what
so.
you'll pay for, right?
Yeah, and we've got a bit of a flow chart in our paper as well that talks about the process that we have from that initial conversation through to when the product lands. And it is about understanding what's available for rescue, what sort of product, what sort of shelf life we need, why we need it that way. And one of the very important requirements that we have, and this is outside of COVID with our school breakfast programs, depending on the government, and our state and territory governments tend to be responsible for funding elements of those programs, they have very strict requirements about who we buy from and the types of products that we buy. So whilst it might be cheaper for us to buy a particular product through a different manufacturer, we are asked to source locally, we are asked to source with specific nutritional outcomes, and we absolutely do that because there are reasons sitting behind it. And I think that's an important conversation to be able to have with manufacturers as well, who might say, hang on, why aren't you buying from us? If we explain to them through that deep relationship why we are preferentially choosing a different supplier, even though their prices might be different, they understand the rationale.
Right. Thanks for explaining. Vandana, you saw an opportunity to connect with new vendors. So talk about the benefits and challenges and how that worked.
Okay, so first of all, the products which are traditionally donated to us by the food businesses is very different from what was required during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the families required more of the essential staples, which was rice, wheat flour, pulses, cooking oils and spices. And these are not what is donated by the businesses to the food banks. Therefore, we had to go in for purchases of these products. And as I said, that we looked and we developed new vendors for the purchase of these products in the wholesale market. And we purchased and bagged these products and distributed. So what came to us from the food businesses. In fact, there's one thing which I'd like to point out, like the others, Brianna also mentioned, that, you know, there was a fall in the food which was available for rescue during the pandemic. But in India, it was not the case, because when everything was locked down, a lot of the products could not be sold. For example, the products which were sold at the airports or railway stations or in restaurants or, you know, theaters, etc. And all those products became surplus for the food businesses. So we had a greater inflow of those kind of products into the food bank, which we were able to distribute. But then there was also the need for the other products, which then we went in for direct purchasing.
And did you find that the new relationships that opened because of COVID will offer ongoing sources for food for your network?
Oh yes, we are continuing to buy from them now. It's 1 year down, almost a year down the line. Yes.
Right. Excellent. I want to go back to a question that Manuel had asked from a staffing perspective. Hold on. Do you have a purchase within your purchasing department? And I recognize that looks different for all of you. Do you focus separately on purchasing basic food, or is that person also in charge of purchasing other items such as vehicles, materials, equipment in general? And has it been successful? Has it been a successful and strategic opportunity having a purchasing department for you? Brianna, your team is probably the most sophisticated. Do you want to talk about breadth of personnel?
Yeah, we have, so first of all, in our structure, Food Bank Australia is a small team. We have a total staff of 13, and we exist to support our state and territory teams to enhance the work that they do and to really leverage those relationships with food and grocery donors. We have a supply chain team consisting of 3 staff, and they are only focused on food and grocery sourcing. So they're not focused on vehicles or other buildings or anything like that. It is quite specifically around food and non-food items for them to be able to both manage the relationships to encourage donations, but also arrange procurement as well. They work very closely with our IT team and our admin team to make sure that we can manually handle all of the purchase orders associated with all of that ordering. And obviously, when we were doing more in 3 months than we did in 3 years, we put a lot of pressure on our IT systems and our admin systems and our payments and payroll, etc. So it was a very busy time for us, but certainly in our state and territory food banks, they have separate teams that look after food sourcing than they would from looking at fundraising for capital investment, as an example. Hopefully that answers the question.
Cool. And Ashley, would that be the same for you?
Yeah, well, we don't and well, we didn't and we don't have a purchasing function. So for food and so any purchasing for I guess say vehicles for the regional centres, whatever, would either be done at the local level, or a small amount of office supplies and stuff like that is done at the centre. So my normal kind of day job has changed quite a bit since for instance the start of December, because I'm actively involved in buying food now. But because my role is one of food acquisition, then it sort of falls to me now. In my pre kind of charity life, I've worked in the food industry and have sold into the supermarket, so I have a bit of kind of knowledge and background on that, but not all of the individuals involved have. So it's been a learning curve. One thing which we did take on additional resources around some of the reporting requirements for government around the funding. So we took on an accountant and we took on a couple of extra logistics people to run that separate supply chain I talked about. So there have been additional pairs of hands, but none of that additional effort was involved in the actual sourcing or purchasing.
Okay, thank you. And then Vandana, given that you have local purchasing, is that similar for you, same people or different?
No, so the purchasing is being done locally, but organized centrally only. So as purchasing was not really big for us initially, so we didn't have anybody dedicated for purchasing function specially. Therefore, we just had to multitask and put in extra hours. But then what we see is that purchasing is going to be an important part of our strategy going forward. And the demand for food has only increased. We don't know, the course of the pandemic also is still uncertain. Therefore, we have plans to add staff for that especially.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for that. I want to come back to Nicole has a question. Is there a cheap source of food that can be re-exported to all food banks? Will any food bank be willing to buy? Is that something that you guys would look at in terms of import of product if the price was right? Vandana, do you want to answer?
Import, as in import from
other countries?
Oh, that won't be an option for us. There are too many regulatory.
That's a challenge, right? Ashley?
Yeah, I don't fully understand, but no, I think we only see it going one way. So we purchase into us, and actually everything we are buying is being used. So we're not anticipating having a surplus of purchase stock kind of at the end of the activity.
Right.
No.
And if another food bank had a source of product that was in excess, would you consider importing to supplement your?
We've never bought it in that way, but we have done sort of swaps and exchanges with other organizations. So so occasionally, so Trustle who I mentioned earlier, so Trustle might ring us up and say, we've got a bit too much of tins of beans kind of thing, could you make use of it? And then
Right.
you know, either take that, or another time we might sort of push stuff their way, but not at a sort of purchasing transactional level. Yeah.
Okay. And Brianna?
We do some offshore purchasing, but it is very specific in terms of what we need it for and the quantities. And because we are so far away from everyone, it tends to be that the transport costs are quite prohibitive, which would cause concern. And coming back to Vandana's point, there are a lot of regulations in Australia about what defines you as a food importer / exporter versus a food relief organisation. So it does tangle you up. But that said, we're very open in sharing any opportunities that we see with multinational partners that we are working with. And if we know that there is an opportunity for other food banks to leverage great opportunities, we're very quick to get in touch with them and say, look, we've got a fabulous contact in, whether it be Sodexo or whoever the company might be, here's a great suggestion, and then we leave it, because I think us being that middleman in international export and import would be a world of pain that I'm not up for.
Exactly. Okay, thanks for that. I want to quickly ask about funding, and then I want to come back and talk about post-COVID. So if attendees have any additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. But first, how did you work with your funding team, your development team, your friends on the other side of the fence, about accessing the funds to make sure that you were procuring the product that you needed? And then, yeah, let's talk about that just quickly first. Brianna, you want to go first on this one? Or go back this way and then this way?
For us, it became a real mix of corporate donations for our state and territory teams, individual donations, and then relations with government. We were somewhat fortunate, if there was a silver lining from the bushfire experience, in that awareness of food bank within the community has never been higher, which meant that when we did launch fundraising appeals and we reached out to corporates to ask for support, they knew exactly who we were, what we do, and the fact that we have impact on the ground. So it made it much easier to have conversations. And when it came to the federal government, equally, through years and years of working with them and showing the social return on investment for what we do, we were a known and trusted partner, which meant that when they received funds to provide for emergency food relief, they knew who to come to, and that we would be able to meet their expectations in terms of delivery on the ground. For us, it was very much around having our fundraising and partnerships team working together with our food sourcing team to really say, when do you need the funds to land? In what sort of quantities, and how can we make this work? And the old conversation around tied funds versus untied funds was really important for us. I mean, the dream for all of us is untied funds, because we can make the decisions about where we know the need and the demand can match up. But for a lot of partners, they have a very specific, we want to donate this money to feed this group of people on Thursdays in schools where people wear purple dresses. And it makes it incredibly difficult to meet those sorts of demands. So we have very robust discussions across our teams, and I apologise because I know we push back on GFN a lot on this as well, where our partners might say, we're going to need, monthly reporting, or we want information on number of people served, or we want, all of these things, which is terrific. And we understand why they want to know that, but we're very open and confident now in pushing back and saying, you don't actually need to know that. We're going to give you a quarterly report or an annual report. We're going to give you case studies. We're going to allow you opportunities to come and visit people on the ground. But what you want and what we're going to give you are actually two different things. And I think if there's one piece of advice I'd provide to newer and emerging food banks, is when your relationship is at a level of maturity when you can have tough conversations, don't be shy about pushing back, because at the end of the day, we're charities. And I think people would be genuinely horrified if they knew that their donated funds were being chewed up in administrative burden and report writing, when we could be spending those funds on getting food to hungry people.
I love the way you said that. Vandana, do you want to talk about your funding in terms of what your funding partners, how they solicited funds to help support purchasing efforts for food?
Okay, so as soon as the lockdowns started, I reached out immediately to our existing partners and put forth a very clear, transparent proposal that this is what we want to do. The ration kits comprising of so much of, whichever products, and what it would cost, how many people it would serve, how many meals it would serve, for how many days. And with this very clear-cut program, I went to our existing partners. It was all virtual and on phone calls. And we were fortunate that because of our strong relationship over the years, we were able to get funding, and we were able to immediately start distribution. Within a week, we were already distributing, already had done purchases and started distributing the emergency food ration kits. And then by word of mouth, by our posts on LinkedIn and social media, we started getting interest from many other corporates also, who wanted to do, employee engagement programs, do virtual food drives with us. And since there was already so much awareness in the community and people wanted to help and do whatever small bit of their own also. So that also brought in those employee engagement programs, virtual food drives, also gotten a lot of financial support for our emergency food assistance programs.
Excellent. And then Ashley, and then I know you had a lot of government funding. Maybe you can also talk about not only sort of fundraising in general, but specifically how you made sure you spent all the money. Because I think to Brianna's comment about having restricted funding for, COVID response, how do you make sure that you do steward those dollars appropriately? And I recognize we're close to time. If you guys don't mind staying a couple more minutes, I think this conversation is great. And I just want to make sure we can sort of tie it up. If anyone has to drop, not you speakers, you can't go anywhere, but if the attendees need to drop off, the recording will be available. So thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, I totally kind of agree with the point about sort of ring-fenced funding, or so I've been at FareShare for almost 7 years, and before that I worked for a charity in the UK called Comet Relief that is a massive sort of fundraiser. And I work in corporate fund, and our nightmare was somebody coming in waving a checkbook to say, but I want it to only children of da-da-da in this place and whatever. So I suppose ours was slightly different because our model is not to fundraise, to purchase. And so we were given the money by essentially government, and part of the caveat to getting the money was a reporting requirement to demonstrate that the money was getting to a certain number of postcodes or places where, but largely they took it on trust that we knew where the food needed to go, and we carried that out. The way that the two big buys have worked with central government money is that effectively they have made an amount available to us. We went out, ordered food on a weekly basis. We're then invoiced for that food. We present the invoice to central government, and they give us the money in sufficient time to us then pay the food partner. Now that caused its own problems because not having a history of purchasing, we don't really have much of a credit score. So sometimes we were either asked to pay up front when we're not getting the money until we sort of demonstrate we've got an invoice for the food or we've received the food, or the amount of credit day terms weren't sufficient to order it, get it, redistribute it, show them the invoice, get the money in and get it back out again. So largely speaking, we've either been able to be flexible enough on the sort of cash flow situation, or partners have understood that because the money is ultimately coming from central government, that we're good for it, and have extended sort of favourable credit terms to us. And so I think the sort of the question on fundraising, the whole COVID thing has certainly done FareShare no harm. So pre-COVID in the UK, 1 in 10 people had heard of FareShare. That number is now 1 in 3. So it's allowed us to sort of, as a stepping stone, to go on to other things, to feature in. So we were the Times newspapers, Christmas charity appeal, that brought some, the stuff that Marcus Rashford has done, which you mentioned. John Lewis did a campaign at Christmas, which is a big retailer here that featured FareShare. So it's all kind of interlinked and the other one sort of thing, but it's certainly done us no harm in terms of our awareness and our ability to fundraise, albeit that we don't fundraise to purchase food or not at the moment.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to answer the final question since you just talked about that. Do you anticipate that purchasing will be part of your food sourcing strategy post-COVID, or do you think that because it's government money that'll be done? Talk about what you think when COVID is over, which it will be.
Yes, yeah. So I think we have, or our leadership team have said that there will be a point at which we will return to being a surplus driven organization. I suppose the debate is kind of when that will be, and whether there'll be another not quite Brexit or another COVID or spike or whatever, which might necessitate. My own personal view is that, and this is completely me talking as me, is that ultimately in the position of the beneficiary, they don't care whether we've had the food donated, whether we bought it, or whether we've been able to source it as surplus. And so, as long as there's that need there, it should always be kind of at least bubbling under as a possibility. But I think FareShare's kind of organizational position is that we will return to being a surplus driven organization at some point in the future.
Great, that's a perfect perspective. Vandana, what is your thought in terms of post-COVID? What do you think purchasing will be in terms of an option for you and your team?
Okay. As far as we see it, the pandemic has highlighted that healthy diets are very important. And therefore, now we're going to place the beneficiary and what they need as the central focus, and therefore acquire foods which are needed by the community for their nourishment. And if surplus food is not we're not able to do that from the surplus food, then purchases will have to be an important part of our strategy going forward.
It's interesting that COVID kind of forced us all to look at purchasing differently, and now I think everybody's a little bit more comfortable with understanding that it can be a way to fill the gap. And Brianna, clearly your team has known this for years now. So what do you think your overall purchasing piece will look like going forward post-COVID versus pre?
A lot of it will depend on funding. We've been very fortunate to secure considerable funding in this current financial year. The big concern and the big unknown for us right now is what happens next. We don't think that demand for food relief is going to diminish much at all in the short term. We know that the impacts economically will linger for a bit longer. If we can't secure good ongoing government funds and corporate funding, we're going to have to revert to heavy reliance on our supplies chain and less focus on the supply chain. So a bit of an unknown.
I love the surprise chain. Okay, I recognize we're a couple minutes over. I do want to thank our speakers. Thank you all for joining. I think this has been a great conversation, clearly the beginning or an ongoing conversation. So I want to emphasize that not only is this recording available, all of the speakers are available for follow-up conversations. You have their direct emails. Feel free to reach out to me or the GFN staff for your regional manager, your field manager, Craig, Chris, Gabby, Anna, Alfredo, depending on which region that you're in, if you have additional questions. I want to thank the GFN staff as well as the production staff for helping this go very smoothly. No tech issues, we're excited. And then I want to definitely thank our vFBLI sponsors, General Mills, HEB, Brambles, Cargill, the DLA Piper Foundation, Fundación Lala, Ingredion. Clearly their funding is making this happen as it does virtually as it did in person. So I think that's it. I want to wish you everyone a good day, a good evening, a good afternoon, and thank you for all the work that every one of you do to help feed your neighbors in need. The work that you do is powerful, and these conversations are so inspirational. So thanks so much.